All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know we love tackling those health topics that really matter, and today we're zeroing in on something that's super fundamental to well-being, triglycerides.
Absolutely.
And we have a great jumping off point. One of our awesome listeners sent in this really valuable resource from the Center for Applied Nutrition, a document called Lowering Your Triglycerides. So our mission today is to unpack this document and get to the heart of it.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so helpful about this kind of deep dive.
Totally.
We're going to take this information, which can be kind of dense and technical sometimes, and really pull out the most important takeaways for you, the learner.
Yeah, the stuff you actually need to know and the stuff you can actually use.
Exactly. What are triglycerides? Why should you care if yours are high? And most importantly, what can you actually do about it based on what this guide is telling us?
Perfect. So let's just dive right in. First things first, what are triglycerides? I think a lot of people hear that word maybe on a blood test or something, but don't really know what it means.
Yeah, it can definitely sound a bit like medical jargon.
For sure.
But the Center for Applied Nutrition does a good job of breaking it down in simple terms. They basically say that triglycerides are the fats that are found in your blood.
Okay, so just fat in the bloodstream. Simple enough.
Right. And, we need fat. Fat is essential for energy. It helps our bodies absorb certain vitamins. It's involved in a lot of important functions. But it's when we have too much of it, particularly these triglycerides circulating in our blood, that it can start to become a problem.
So it's like the fuel our body stores up.
Exactly, like a reserve fuel tank.
Got it.
And if that tank gets too full, that's when things can go wrong.
Okay, so that makes sense. So we know there are fats in the blood. But when do we know if our levels are too high? What's that tipping point?
Well, the guide actually gives us a very specific number to watch out for.
Oh, perfect.
They say that if your triglyceride level is greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter after you've fasted for 8 to 10 hours,
Okay.
that's considered high.
All right, so that's the magic number, 150.
Oh.
If you see that, that's when you need to start paying attention.
Yeah, that's a signal that you might need to make some changes to bring those levels down.
So let's talk about why that is. What are the risks associated with having high triglycerides? Because, hearing about fat in your blood, it doesn't sound great.
Yeah, it's not just an aesthetic thing.
Yeah.
It can have some pretty serious health implications.
Right.
The Center for Applied Nutrition lists a whole bunch of potential problems that are linked to high triglycerides. Things like stroke, heart disease, diabetes, and even pancreatitis.
Whoa, okay, so this is some serious stuff.
Definitely not something to ignore.
Not at all. All right, so now we know what triglycerides are, we know what a healthy level is, and we understand why it's so important to keep those levels in check. So the big question is, what causes them to go up in the first place?
Right, because if we can understand the causes, then we can start to look at how to address them.
Exactly.
And the guide points to a couple of main culprits. One is certain underlying health conditions,
Okay,
and the other is certain medications that people might be taking.
got it. So let's break those down one by one. Let's start with the health conditions. What kinds of things are we talking about here?
Sure. The document specifically mentions things like being overweight or obese, having diabetes, and having hypothyroidism.
Okay.
Those are some of the key conditions that can contribute to elevated triglyceride levels.
So those are conditions we've heard of before.
Yeah, they're pretty common. And it kind of highlights how interconnected everything is in our bodies,
Totally, yeah. It's not just one thing in isolation.
Right, it's all these systems kind of working together or sometimes working against each other.
For sure. Okay, so those are some of the health conditions. What about the medications? Are there any specific ones that we should be aware of?
Yes, the document actually gives a pretty specific list. So some of the medications that are associated with increased triglyceride levels are things like tamoxifen, beta blockers, steroids, diuretics, and even oral contraceptives like birth control pills.
Okay, wow. So those are pretty common medications.
Yeah, and it's not to say that if you're taking any of these medications, you're definitely going to have high triglycerides.
Right.
But it's just something to be aware of, to keep an eye on, and to talk to your doctor about if you have any concerns.
Absolutely. It's all about having that open communication with your healthcare provider. Okay, so we've talked about some of the things that can cause high triglycerides. Now let's get to the really practical stuff. What can we do to lower them? And the guide spends a good chunk of time talking about diet, and it seems like sugar is enemy number one, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The document really hammers home the importance of cutting back on sugar and ideally eliminating added sugars from your diet as much as possible.
Okay, so what kinds of things are we talking about here? Give us the hit list. What are the sugary culprits?
All right, so we're talking about things like candy, cookies, pies, pastries, ice cream, frozen yogurt, all that good stuff.
Yeah, the usual
Right.
suspects.
But it also includes things like those fat-free desserts, which can be deceiving,
Oh, yeah, they sound healthy.
right? Because they're fat-free,
Hmm,
but they often load them up with sugar to make up for the lack of fat in terms of taste and texture.
interesting. So those are kind of sneaky.
Yeah, definitely something to watch out for.
All right, so sweets and desserts, got it. What else?
Well, then there are all the sugary
Oh,
drinks,
yeah, of course.
like fruit juice, soda, sweetened iced tea and coffee, lemonade, fruit punch, sports drinks, energy drinks. All those things are loaded with sugar.
Wow, okay, so it's really about being mindful of those added sugars, not just in the obvious places like desserts, but also in our beverages.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding those specific items. The guide also emphasizes limiting any added sugar you might be putting in things yourself, as well as things like syrups and honey.
Got it. So really being conscious of sugar across the board.
Absolutely.
Okay, so sugar is out. What else does the document say we should be cutting back on? I know alcohol and smoking were mentioned.
Yeah, the advice there is pretty straightforward. Decrease or eliminate alcohol consumption, and if you're a smoker, quitting is hugely beneficial.
Makes sense. Those are kind of no-brainers for overall health anyway.
Exactly, but they specifically impact triglyceride levels as well.
Okay, so we're cutting back on sugar, alcohol, and smoking. Now, what about carbohydrates? There's always so much talk about carbs and their impact on health. What does our guide say about them?
Yeah, carbs can be tricky because there's so many different types.
Right.
And the Center for Applied Nutrition specifically calls out refined carbohydrates as being something to limit.
Okay, refined carbohydrates. So what falls under that umbrella?
Think white bread, white rice, white pasta.
Okay, so the processed stuff.
Exactly. Anything made with white flour, like a lot of baked goods. Also things like pretzels, rice cakes, and those breakfast cereals that are made with refined grains.
Got it. So it's not that all carbs are bad, but those refined carbs are the ones we want to watch out for.
Right. They tend to be digested really quickly, which can spike your blood sugar, and that can lead to your body producing more triglycerides.
Interesting. So if we're cutting back on the white stuff, what are the good carbs? What should we be eating instead?
The guide strongly recommends switching to whole grains.
Okay, makes sense.
So instead of white bread, choose whole grain bread. Instead of white rice, opt for brown rice. Instead of regular pasta, go for whole wheat pasta.
So it's about making those swaps.
Exactly. And they also highlight some other great whole grains like quinoa, oats, barley, and wild rice.
Oh, I love quinoa.
Yeah, it's delicious and so versatile.
Absolutely. And it also mentioned legumes, right?
Yes, beans and lentils are great choices. They're packed with fiber and protein, and they have a much gentler impact on your blood sugar compared to those refined carbs.
Okay, good to know. Now, there was a really interesting point in the document that I wanted to touch on. It basically said that eating too much of any kind of carbohydrate, even the healthy ones, can still contribute to high triglycerides.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance.
Right. Because it's easy to think, okay, brown rice is good, so I can eat as much of it as I want.
Right. But even the good carbs, when eaten in excess, can be converted into triglycerides by your liver.
Wow. So it's really about moderation with everything.
Absolutely. Portion control is key.
Okay, so we've talked about the things to limit in our diet: sugar, alcohol, refined carbs. Now let's talk about the foods that can actually help lower triglycerides. And I know the document mentions omega-3 fatty acids, those good fats.
Yes, omega-3s are super important for heart health, and they can definitely help lower triglycerides.
Okay.
And the guide specifically recommends eating fatty fish as one of the best sources of omega-3s.
What kinds of fish are we talking about?
Things like salmon, mackerel, sardines, tuna, trout.
Okay, so the oily fish.
Exactly. Aim for at least 2 servings per week.
Got it. Now, what about for people who don't eat a lot of fish, maybe for dietary reasons or just personal preference? Are there any other sources of omega-3s that the guide mentions?
Definitely. They list things like flaxseed oil, ground flaxseed, walnuts, and soy products as good plant-based sources of omega-3s.
Okay, so even if you're not a big fish eater, you can still get those beneficial fats in your diet.
Absolutely. And dark leafy greens also contain some omega-3s, although in smaller amounts.
Got it. Now, beyond omega-3s, I know the document also mentions monounsaturated fats as being beneficial for lowering triglycerides.
Yes, monounsaturated fats are another type of healthy fat that can help improve your cholesterol levels and reduce your risk of heart disease.
Okay, so what are some good sources of those?
Well, they recommend things like olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil, nuts like almonds, cashews, and pecans, and also seeds like sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds.
So basically those heart-healthy fats that we hear so much about. Okay, so we've covered the good fats. Now let's flip the script and talk about the bad fats, the ones we should be avoiding or limiting. And I know trans fats were specifically mentioned.
Yeah, trans fats are definitely something you want to steer clear of as much as possible.
Why is that?
They're really bad for your heart. They raise your bad cholesterol and lower your good cholesterol, which is basically the opposite of what we want.
Right, so how do we avoid them?
The best way is to read food labels carefully. Look for anything that says partially hydrogenated oil. That's a telltale sign that trans fats are present.
Okay, so check the labels, avoid partially hydrogenated oil. Got it.
And then the other type of fat to be mindful of is saturated fat.
Okay, so what are the main sources of saturated fat that we should be limiting?
Think things like fatty cuts of meat, full-fat dairy products, butter, lard, and coconut oil.
Okay, so the richer, more indulgent fats.
Exactly. And it's not that you have to completely eliminate these things, but just be mindful of your intake.
Moderation is key.
Always.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about diet. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the other lifestyle factors that the guide mentions. And weight management was a big one, right?
Absolutely. Achieving and maintaining a healthy weight is one of the most important things you can do for your overall health. And it can have a significant impact on your triglyceride levels.
Okay, and I know the document made a really encouraging point about this.
Oh yeah, they highlighted that even a relatively small amount of weight loss, like 10 to 15 pounds, can make a big difference.
Really?
Yeah, it can significantly lower your triglycerides, improve your cholesterol, and reduce your risk of heart disease.
Wow, that's really motivating to hear.
Yeah, it shows that even small changes can have a big impact.
Absolutely. And it's not about having to make these drastic, unsustainable changes.
Right, it's about finding those small things that you can incorporate into your life and stick with over the long term.
Exactly. And speaking of lifestyle changes, the other big one that the guide mentioned was exercise, right?
Yes, regular physical activity is another crucial piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so what's the recommendation in terms of how much exercise we should be getting?
They suggest aiming for at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise most days of the week, so that's about 3.5 hours per week.
All right, so 30 minutes a day, most days of the week. Got it.
And it doesn't have to be anything super intense. Just getting your heart rate up and moving your body can make a big difference.
Awesome. Okay, so to wrap things up, we've learned a lot from this deep dive into the Center for Applied Nutrition's guide on lowering triglycerides. We now know that triglycerides are fats found in our blood. High levels can be really harmful to our health, and the best way to manage them is through a combination of diet and lifestyle changes.
Exactly. And we've gone through the specific dietary recommendations, focusing on reducing sugar, refined carbs, and unhealthy fats, while increasing our intake of fiber, omega-3 fatty acids, and monounsaturated fats.
Right, and we also talked about the importance of maintaining a healthy weight and getting regular exercise.
So you now have a really solid understanding, thanks to this fantastic resource, of the things that influence your triglyceride levels and what you can do to keep them in a healthy range.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that it's not about making these huge, overwhelming changes. It's about making small, sustainable changes that you can stick with over time.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we always say, knowledge is power. And armed with this information, you can start making those small changes today that can have a big impact on your health in the long run.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.